bit warmer the last time I was in South Africa. They say rain is good luck, so let's have at it. So we're going to talk about the race for supply chain 2030. And often when I'm traveling, people will say to me, well, Lora, what is it that you do? Are you a consultant? And I say, no, I'm not a consultant. Consultants think they have all the answers. I'm a researcher. And I'm a bit of a skeptic. So when technologists tell me they have the best thing, I say, show me. And I write about it, and I take a hard stance because I only write things when I feel in my heart they're good. And I'm a social scientist. I do quantitative research. I interview supply chain professionals. I speak around the world. And I'm looking for patterns. And I'm trying to figure out why are 9 out of 10 supply chain leaders stuck in delivering supply chain performance? And what is the future of technologies? And what does that mean for what talent needs to look like? And what is the best way to actually structure a global supply chain? So you'll see me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and my Twitter handles at the bottom of my slides. I'm Lora Cecere. And I'll be asking people to join me in some surveys. And if you choose to join me, then I give all my research away, and I do webinars, and I actually share all the research with people openly. But I'm also a fortune teller. I look to the future and I say, what could supply chain look like? What if we were to use these new technologies and we would imagine the supply chain of the future? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I don't write for the technologists. Most industry analysts write for the IT guy, but I'm writing for you. I'm writing for the line of business user to try to help it really come to life and be easier to drive supply chain excellence. So I'm going to talk from the research that I've done, and all the research is open. You'll find it on SlideShare, you'll find it on LinkedIn, you'll find it in my community, you'll find it on my website. And I want to give my research away to help drive global supply chain leadership. And I think it's important because unless we're able to share globally, we can't really drive what we need to do in supply chain management. Because I believe supply chains build economies. I believe they save the world. And so you can find me on SlideShare and Twitter and LinkedIn. And let's begin. So we're going to talk about 2030, but I'm an old gal. I've been in supply chain for about 40 years. And I want to look back, 15 years, when I was running factories for Procter & Gamble and Kraft and Clorox, my world looked like this. I had an inner office envelope. Do you remember those? Right? I didn't have a computer on my desk. And in fact, the portable computer was so big that it took 3 men to carry it down the hallway. And we had cell phones that didn't work very well. In fact, they were so large, they didn't fit in my purse. And this was our world 15 years ago. In fact, 1982 was the first time that supply chain was written about with source, make, and deliver together as cross-functional processes. So it's really not that old. And when we think about 15 years ago, we've got to really come back and think about interoffice mail and these big cell phones. And look at where we are today with technology. But why are we stuck, right? 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Bricks Matter. It was the 30th anniversary of supply chain management. And I wanted to write the celebratory book about how first and second generation supply chain pioneers had improved cost, and improved inventory, and improved asset utilization, and improved customer service. And I believed in my heart we had done that. But when I looked at balance sheets, I couldn't find it. And in fact, I had worked with 600 companies as an analyst, and I had looked narrowly at a project vision, and I couldn't see that they were driving improvement. So one of the things I started to do was to mine data. Let me tell you a little bit about this chart. What I do is I sit on 15 years of supply chain financial data, and I look at the industry by industry code, or NACS code. And I was looking at the period of 2006 to 2015. 2007 was the start of the Great Recession, and it's one that had a mark on the supply chain that we'll remember for a long time. And I wanted to say, where are we when we compare 2015 to 2006? So the numbers with the red arrow going down says that the averages in 2015 are lower or worse than 2006. The numbers in green represent that we've made improvement. Now, when you look at this chart, you see more red than you see green. And most of the time, people are not holding themselves accountable to balance sheet results. Growth has slowed in the global economy, and as growth slows, I believe that the supply chain is the engine of growth. I believe we've got to move past cost agendas to really drive value-based outcomes, and that requires us to manage this supply chain metrics portfolio holistically. And to manage it holistically, we've got to look that it's a complex system, and we've got to build outside-in processes. Our current systems are inside out. So we wait to catch orders or to track shipments, and it puts the supply chain on the back foot. So as a result, when I ask people, is your supply chain working well? And this is a series of attributes where we say, is your supply chain tactical or strategic? Is it cautious? Is it risk-taking? Is there room for improvement? Or is it working well? Is it proactive or reactive? And we say to supply chain leaders, which of these descriptors best fit your supply chain? And you can see that about a third think that there's room for improvement, and about a third think it's working well. And most would like a supply chain that's much more proactive, much more controlled, much more aligned with speed. And so as you think about our architectures and our processes, I believe we cannot evolve to close this gap. Instead, I think we're at a disruptive phase of the supply chain where we've got to move from inside-out processes to outside-in processes. And what does that mean? It means starting with independent demand and channel demand and using new forms of analytics to sense. The traditional supply chain doesn't sense, it responds. And in fact, it responds with a late response. Demand latency, or what the order represents, has actually increased 10 to 15 times in the last decade. Now, what do I mean by that? The order carries latency, meaning the offset lead time from someone buying the product in the channel. So for Tide detergent at a modern retail store, for Procter & Gamble, the order latency is about 10 days. But for an allergen product, the order latency could be 120 days. As we look at the evolution of items and complexity in the supply chain, order latency has increased, and the supply chain has become much more fixed and lacks proactivity. And so the way to really solve that is to be outward facing, outside in, and to use independent demand or channel demand, and to be able to use new forms of data and analytics and visibility. So when we look at what are the attributes of companies that say that their supply chains are working well, and unfortunately the screens are too small, you can't see this, but at a 90% confidence level, the companies that say that their supply chains are not working well cannot get to data, and they do not have good forms of visibility. And this research is actually very detailed on my site, and you can read all the information. But I'm going to talk about what is data and what is visibility, because sometimes we throw these terms out, and as we get into new forms of analytics, data structures and visibility changes. Now today our pain levels, our demand and supply volatility is increasing. We lack cross-functional alignment. In fact, I find that when companies are able to align with operations and sales, they'll make faster progress on the metrics that matter. Most people struggle to use data, And there's a lack of availability of skilled talent for the workplace. In fact, recent research says by 2030 we'll need 7 supply chain professionals for every one we have today. What we have is the grading of the first and second generation pioneers. They're leaving the workforce. We have an increased importance in supply chain and the need for the global economy. And supply chain has become much more important, which is driving a lot of new business models. And so this talent issue is one of the things that I'm all about. I'm trying to help the workforce of tomorrow to think about supply chains differently outside in. And it boils down to risk. So if you look at the risk drivers of 5 years ago versus the future 5 years, the size of the ball looks at the amount of business pain. And you can see product quality is a very high business pain, but we think we have that pretty well in our sights that we can fix it. But supplier viability, the ability of the supply base to have models that are viable, and demand variability and global economic uncertainty are huge risks that are hanging around the supply chain. And as I stand on the stadium today, I say that we can't solve these problems with the traditional supply chain processes that we've had for the last 30 years. Instead, I think we've got to learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink what the future is. And so the pressure is on operations. People are saying we need to do more. And you know, if you look at the Fortune 500, 52% of the companies have gone bankrupt. And so it's pretty serious, right? A lot of mergers and acquisitions are being driven by shareholder activism. This is what drove the merger of Dow and DuPont. It's what drove the merger of Kraft and Heinz. And the amount of shareholder activism is growing, and people are saying, we need to do more with these supply chain assets, and I agree. And one of the things that I find is really interesting, because I'm an old gal, if I look at global growth and productivity from innovation, you know, we had 50 years of productivity with the combustion engine and electrical connectivity. And that carried us into second-tier innovation. But I was part of the initial adoption of the computer age, and I didn't realize that productivity from the computer age stopped in 2004. And so as we think about the movement to making the digital pivot, we've got to really think about global productivity and how do we use these new technologies to erase the fact that global productivity from technologies is slowed. And making the digital pivot is not so easy because it requires us to reskill our brains and talk a new language. So we've been used to talking the language of 3-letter acronyms: ERP, APS, CRM, SCD, WMS. In fact, it's geek talk, right? We talk geek talk, right? 3-letter acronyms. And we assumed that analytics would evolve from these early systems. And on the other side, we have workforce productivity tools, Excel spreadsheets, Access. But in the middle, we're starting to see the evolution of new forms of analytics: cognitive learning, rules-based ontologies, Hadoop, non-relational databases, unstructured data, a whole new language that I'm going to help you to be able to sort through. And these new forms of analytics are going to make many of the technologies we have today legacy. ERP is not the future of the backbone for the extended network. And APS, or advanced planning, will be redefined. I believe we're 5 years away from supply chain planning systems that will think as we sleep. And instead of getting exceptions, we will learn, and we will no longer have to hand code master data. We're very close to that, and we see about 9% of early adopters starting to adopt these new forms of analytics. And when we think about these new forms of analytics, this is not where we have big projects like the years of ERP. These are small incremental projects really driven by scrappy teams that are line of business and IT that cross the generations. And it requires self-funding and real learning about these new forms of analytics. I find them very exciting, and I hope by the end of my presentation when I go to the visitors lounge that you will too, and you'll come and talk to me about them, because I think that we have the opportunity to really transform the supply chain. But before we begin the journey into 2030, let's talk about where are we as an organization. The supply chain by the numbers on average has 7 functions reporting to it. And today one of the issues and one of the barriers of why we're stuck is we're very stuck into functional thinking. Manufacturing metrics, procurement metrics, delivery metrics, and cross-functional orchestration across the supply chain, while we say end-to-end, is difficult because most people reward functional excellence. It's only when source, make, and deliver report to the same organization that we can start to see the alignment and get over some of that hurdle. Now, 1/3 of companies have a supply chain center of excellence, and you might say, well, that's all goodness, and I do agree, but 1 in 2 fail. And there are 3 reasons why they fail. A lack of clarity about what is supply chain excellence, and that's what I'm studying. It's a tough subject. The second thing is the lack of understanding by the executive team. Because supply chain is so new, many of our executives don't understand the principles of supply chain. And the third is the supply chain center of excellence will become academic and out of touch with the organization. It needs to serve the organization. It needs to be pulled into the organization. And so even though we have supply chain centers of excellence, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to deliver excellence. Because in many organizations, the supply chain's a function. Now, when I was a first generation pioneer, I never thought the supply chain would become a function. I thought it would be from the customer's customer, the supplier's supplier. But when I go to companies and I talk about getting channel data and designing outside-in processes and using channel data and analytics to really drive sensing, people will say, whoa, sales won't let us do that. Wow, that's sales' job, right? If we're going to really be customer-centric, we have to cross over sales, apply new forms of analytics, and the supply chain cannot be a function. We have to get executive leadership to be able to go from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier. And along the way, we've got to reskill for mid-management talent. Now, yesterday I had the opportunity to go on a ride around Sun City with someone who was a driver from South Africa, and he talked about the unemployment rate in South Africa. And we've got a mid-management talent gap globally. We can get people out of school, but we can't get senior managers and directors globally with talent. And this is actually, I think, an opportunity for you to actually use your brains globally to help the global supply chain. This mid-management talent gap is extremely acute, and it's very much at the intersection of business process and analytics. If you're going to reskill your brain and really drive against that mid-management talent gap, I want you to really listen to what I'm going to talk to you about in analytics. On average, in the United States, it takes 14 months right now to get a demand or an S&OP planner. 2 years ago, it was 9 months. The salaries are increasing. I have a community where people can openly post jobs, and I track the salaries. We have a lot of people in the supply chain execution world. That's not where the skill gap is. Warehouse management, supply chain execution, transportation, there's an excess of talent there. Where the real need is in the analytics area and the ability to understand process and power analytics. And it's very acute in the global supply chain in Africa and South America. So when SAPICS said, Laura, come and talk at our 50th anniversary, I thought about that 16-hour plane ride. I thought about the 2-hour trip to Sun City, the difference in time zone, and I'm like, do I really want to do this? But I came because I really want you to reskill in the area of analytics. just as I'm reskilling my brain, I want to encourage you to do the same, because we're short on mid-management global talent. And when I talk about that companies are stuck, I want to tell you a story. In the 1990s, I sold software. And I would go into a company and I would say, if you buy my software, I'm going to improve operating margin and inventory turns. And I believe the picture would look something like this. The more technology they implemented, the better we would be, and we would drive real value in the supply chain. But when I sat down to write the book Bricks Matter, I was shocked to find out that we had not made that kind of improvement. And one of the reasons is that the supply chain is a complex system, and I'm an engineer and I actually got to take system theory twice. And we have complex processes and increasing complexity, but this is a non-linear system that we've tried to solve through linear optimization. And as a result, we haven't been able to really drive the balance on the effective frontier of growth, profitability, cycles, inventory turns, cash to cash, and complexity, our asset utilization, return on invested capital. These metrics are non-linear and very interrelated and require a deeper type of analytics and a clarity of strategy. So one of the things I did was I said, well, where do we have correlation to value? And I looked at market capitalization and price to market to tangible book. And I find that the inventory metrics have a high correlation, and I also find that operating margin has a high correlation. So I started looking at patterns, and let me talk to you a little bit about what I'm showing you, because it's a little different. And when I first started looking at these slides, I thought, wow, this is a little bit like modern art. But this is Dow, and this is DuPont. And this is looking at year-over-year changes in operating margin and inventory turns year over year. So this is 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and here we are at 2015. So Dow in 2014 was about the same level it was in 2006. Look at DuPont. How many times have you seen a DuPont speaker on the stage? DuPont is much worse in 2015 than they were in 2006. This is what drove the merger. And a lot of times people will say, well, Laura, the answer's lean. Just lean out the supply chain. And I say, lean is a tactic that must be tied to outcomes. And if lean was the answer, why is Toyota at the same place in 2015 that it was in 2006? And why has Honda not made any progress? We need to be accountable to the balance sheet. Because if we look at Toyota, Toyota's stuck, Honda's stuck. And so lean by itself is not the answer either. And if we look at other companies, they look like this. I could go on and on, I could give you your companies, but we're going around in circles. And we're going around in circles because we have some beliefs that if we focus on project excellence, we'll drive supply chain strategy. If we focus on functional excellence, we'll drive supply chain strategy. If we focus on inside efficiency, we'll drive supply chain strategy. And those are all three false statements. Functional excellence will throw the supply chain out of balance. Most companies have thousands of projects and they don't align, and it'll throw the supply chain out of balance. And we must align to really drive process excellence. So if we look at, competitors, this is Eli Lilly versus Novo Nordisk, you want a pattern more like Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is making progress. Overall, when you look at it, they're better at operating margin and not as good at inventory turns as Eli Lilly, but Eli Lilly's going backwards. Only 10% of companies are like Novo Nordisk, making progress. And so I've tracked supply chain improvement for all publicly held companies. If you're a publicly held company, you can go to my website and you can look at yourself versus peer group. And what I'm doing is I'm mining the data on these charts. And every year I publish the supply chains to admire. And I judge a supply chain by, are we driving performance better than the peer group? and the metrics that matter of growth, operating margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital. Are we above the peer group? And are we driving improvement? More like Novo Nordisk versus the slides I showed you of Merck or BMS or Dow or DuPont or Toyota or Honda. And publicly, of all companies that report public data, for 2015, there were 25 companies. So I say, if we only had 25 companies that met this definition, can we say we have best practices? I don't think so. We can say we have current practices. We can learn from the current practices. But I think we've got to really stand up and be accountable to the balance sheet and think about how we can use new technologies. Because today's supply chains are stuck because we're not clear on supply chain excellence. We've focused on functional excellence. We've had isolated projects with the belief if we have a return on investment, supply chain excellence will follow. We haven't designed the supply chain. When I talk about form and function of inventory and push-pull decoupling points, we're not active in design. I was a chemical engineer. I learned how to design distillation columns and heating exchangers, but designing the supply chain is something that we're still very young at. And we're not managing the metrics holistically across the organization. So to get unstuck, and this is from my book, you have to really manage the metrics across the functions and align everyone at a bonus and an execution level on the metrics on the effective frontier, which is growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital, and align the functional metrics to reliability. And that will help to drive alignment and unstick the supply chain. Okay, so I've talked about we have a talent gap. The biggest opportunities in analytics and process. But we're stuck today, and we can't just say we have best practices, we've really got to challenge ourselves. And now I want to talk about the two things that differentiate the supply chain from working well or not working well, which are visibility and data. So when we look at visibility, I said that order latency has increased 10 to 15 times over the last decade. And the reason is the long tail. The original systems that we implemented for supply chain planning were designed for an efficient response. Items that had high volume and were very predictable. As we have added items and we have grown globally and we have localization, all of our supply chains have grown a long tail. And the longer the tail, the greater the need for the types of analytics I'm going to talk about. Because we can't forecast these items. These items are not easily predicted. They have to be sensed. And they need a responsive design. And the other issue is that outsourcing is our reality. You know, when I first started in supply chain, our supply chains were regional, and my factory was down the street, and my distribution center was out my office. Today, about a third of the manufacturing is outsourced, and logistics are outsourced about 50% on average. The supply chains are longer, they have more nodes, every node adds variability, and it requires different levels of connectivity. So we have three primary ways we connect. We can have a signal coming from ERP out, like SAP SNC. We can have EDI, which is essentially a document that has to be opened. Or we can invest in supply chain operating networks with canonical infrastructures and many-to-many data sources. Now, the canonical infrastructures allow us to allow trading partners to connect in the way they want to connect, whether it's XML, EDI, RosettaNet, fax to EDI, they choose. But the many-to-many data models allow us to have a canonical infrastructure to improve connectivity. 7% of the world flows today go through business networks. These are tools like Elimica and GHX and E2Open. And we're starting to see consolidation and growth in these platforms. And one of the things that I'm trying to drive is interoperability across these supply chain operating networks. So whether it's Ariba by SAP or GXS or GHX, that we can have better connectivity with interoperability. And the reason is that when we talk about supply chain visibility, I say to people, what do you mean by visibility? And they'll look at me like, aren't you the dumbest analyst in the world? But, you know, maybe I am, but when you look at visibility, there are a lot of areas. So what we've really automated is visibility within the manufacturing facility. So when you look at this slide, blue is what's important to companies, red is current performance. Not a lot of gap in manufacturing, but look at the gap in enterprise order management. That's channel management, distributor management, the ability to see the channel. We're blind, we can't sense. And with a longer tail, we need to sense. We need demand networks with analytics that allow us to sense. Look at first-tier suppliers, very large gap. Transportation providers, very large gap. Third-party manufacturing, large gap. And then look at second, third-tier suppliers. And you might think, well, do they really matter? But remember, what put Ford down in the horrible events in Japan was a bolt manufacturer in Japan. It was a second and third tier supplier. Now, one of the issues is many supply chain leaders that I talk to don't even know where their suppliers are. We had a horrible event in the United States called Hurricane Sandy. And I went to see a large food company the day after Hurricane Sandy. And I said to them, how did you do through Hurricane Sandy? Because I knew they had plants in the East Coast. And they said, we did fine. We've accounted for all of our employees, and our plants are fine. And I said, great. I said, but what about your packaging supplier on Long Island? And what about your flavor supplier in New Jersey? And he got kind of ashen, and he said, I'll be right back with you. He, like most of you, don't know where our second and third tier suppliers are. So when a global event happens, not only do you not have visibility, but you don't know where those physical locations are. And as a result, we end up with disruptions. The average supply chain has one material disruption a year. And when we think about visibility and we think about outside-in processes and using independent demand, we've got to use analytics to really get at the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect is the principle that the more we translate demand across tiers, the more we distort the signal and amplify error. And so, as a result, what most manufacturers or transportation providers get is a signal with very high error. And one of the reasons why this is so important is for corporate social responsibility. Today, 90% of companies have a corporate social responsibility document. 70% make a claim that they do something good for the planet based on their marketing, but only 20% actually own the extended supply chain, where 65% of non-renewable resources are. So to be able to get a corporate social responsibility, to be able to manage risk, we've got to manage visibility. And the answer here is supply chain operating networks with cognitive learning and rules-based ontologies. Now, I've talked about what is a canonical infrastructure. Now I'm going to talk about rules-based ontologies and cognitive learning. So let's build the outside-in process. I think we're 5 years away from supply chains that learn as we sleep. I think this will make our current planning systems largely obsolete with prescriptive and cognitive analytics. Not everybody will adopt it right away, but you'll start to see the supply chain planning systems dramatically change. I think this concept of a network of networks with interoperability between supply chain operating networks will start to take hold in the next 10 years so that we can have a signal that goes across Alemica to E2Open to GHX. I also believe that when we come to our offices in the morning, we'll talk to our screens like we talk to Siri on our iPhone. And we'll say, good morning, how did we do last night? And we'll get a response. Perhaps In Johannesburg, we had an outage in transportation. Or perhaps in Athens, we had a manufacturing issue. And the computer will talk to us and say, our recommendation is because of cognitive learning. We're starting to see a dramatic change in user interface and analytics. And I also think we're going to see a dramatic acceleration in new business models. What we've seen with Amazon and e-commerce, we're going to start to see the Uberization and the collaborative economy evolve, where we have a focus on service. One of the issues, hang on just 1 second. It's so cold that I have a frog in my throat. One of the issues is that in the service supply chain, we've never been able to forecast service parts. And new business models will focus on service. So I'll tell you a story. I have a refrigerator in my apartment in Philadelphia, and I had a knock on my door the other day, and the maintenance repairman says, there's a bearing in your refrigerator that's going to go out, and I'd like to fix it. And I said, well, I didn't call you, but you're welcome to come in and fix it. He put a carpet down and he started to fix it, and sure enough, it was a bad bearing. And I said, how did you know this? My computer talks to the Internet of Things for that refrigerator, and he was sensing the fact that the refrigerator was not able to keep a temperature. So what if the Internet of Things totally redefined service? What if we no longer had to forecast spare parts? What if we had the ability to drive new business models off of the Internet of Things, or the ability to totally disintermediate certain pieces of the supply chain? We need to be open to new business models because I think the supply chain is the engine of growth. So as we look at 2030, the first thing that's going to happen is this embracing of new forms of analytics that I'm going to talk about. Then we're going to see the real movement on the Internet of Things that I'll also share some case studies. And then we'll see 3D printing adoption. And I'll talk to you about the case studies for that, and robotics. The digital pivot is about the coalescence of all these technologies. And underneath all of these technologies are new forms of analytics and new terms for us to learn. So let's start with data. There are three kinds of architectures that are evolving. Cloud-based architectures, which allow us to go across architectures and do reporting. I'm very excited about cloud-based architectures that can really go across heterogeneous environments. I'm also very excited about streaming data and streaming data architectures. We see streaming data architectures with sensing and telematics. And the streaming data architectures require architectures that allow us to move data at a real-time basis. But not all data needs to fly first class. And in fact, what we need to focus on is right-time data. Well, we also need data lakes. And data lakes allow us to bring data of different sorts and mine the data for the answers that we don't know to ask. So for example, one of my clients is Kellogg's. When Kellogg's manufactured products that had smelly liners, they didn't think about asking, do my liners stink? But if they were listening to social media and they were mining data in data lakes, they would have seen the answers to the questions that they didn't know to ask. So as we think about these architectures, we need to think about clouds and streams and lakes. And we also need to think about the fact that analytics as we know it today, we only see in transactional data. We want the data to fit in rows and columns, and we feel really good when we have a relational database and we can put optimization on top of it. But our new forms of data are about data variety. It's about unstructured data. And what is unstructured data? It's data that won't fit in a row and column. It can be warranty data, quality data, social data. It could be email, it could be customer service data. All of this data is at the doorstep of the organization and we don't mine it. and sensor data, which is streaming data, the supply chain doesn't sense, and new data forms like maps and pictures and GPS. So as we think about big data analytics, we've got to think not only about volume, because the average supply chain doesn't have more than a petabyte of data. Instead, we've got to think about velocity, and we've got to think about variety. And we've got to think about a progressive evolution of intelligence. Most of the analytics we have today are descriptive analytics. It allows the visualization of analytics. And the early form of planning was predictive analytics, linear optimization. What we're moving to is prescriptive analytics, which allows us to see an occurrence and it recommends an action. And cognitive computing that allows learning as the supply chains operate. And 7% of companies today are experimenting with cognitive and prescriptive analytics, which are very different than the forms of analytics that we've had traditionally. They're also experimenting with a term called Hadoop. The e-commerce vendors, people like eBay and Amazon, when I go visit them, they never have master data issues. But every company that I go to in supply chain, the first issue they always throw up is master data. Hadoop evolved to allow massive parallel processing because the e-commerce vendors could not use relational databases at the scale that we needed to fund e-commerce. And Hadoop has been around for 10 years, and what we're starting to see is Hadoop allows the movement of data to allow the data at rest to be moved and indexed, which changes integration. Now, as you look at these terms, which maybe you can't read them because the slide's so small, it's terms like hive and pig and jive. These are terms we don't know, but these are open source terms, and we're getting new vendors that are Hadoop-based vendors. Now, why should you care about Hadoop? Well, the average company has 5 ERP systems. We go through mergers and acquisitions, and every time we go through a merger and acquisition, we have the discussion about integration and data warehouses and the ability to get reporting. Imagine that you no longer have to have that discussion. Imagine if you have Hadoop, and Hadoop will allow you, without tight integration, to go get data, and it will allow you to leave the data at rest and index data, much like what happens in a search engine. So Hadoop totally transforms integration. Now, to run Hadoop, we have to use non-relational databases and open source code and work with companies that have what's termed committers, which allow us to write to the open source code. It's a whole different level of technology than what you see from vendors like SAP and Oracle and Microsoft. So non-relational databases in Hadoop offer us great promises for integration. We also have a great promise as we look at unstructured data with Hadoop. When I go to talk to companies about data analytics, they say, let's map your data. On one axis, let's put data on velocity, at the speed in which it needs to move. On the other axis, let's put your structured data and your unstructured data. And what you'll find in that exercise is current supply chain technologies allow you to move structured data in a tightly integrated way. But you struggle with the ability to use unstructured data or streaming data, and that's where we're seeing these new forms of integration and the new technologies for non-relational databases. Now, I believe that 5 years from now, we'll have architectures that look like this. This is a rules-based ontology. And when you think about today's rules, you've got allocation rules, you've got ATP rules, you've got transportation rules, you've got lead time rules, and we solved those in our first generation supply chain systems with single ifs to single thens. But imagine that each of these lines is a multiple if to a multiple then, and each of these circles is either cognitive or prescriptive analytics. And this system will learn as the supply chain progresses. So each of these nodes, the color, is a learning system on top of existing analytics. Rules-based ontologies and cognitive analytics, I think, will greatly transform the supply chain. Today's supply chain doesn't play by the rules, but what if we had an adaptive system that could learn and adapt, and we no longer had to hard code master data? I think this is coming. And the shift is that, the average company today has 150 different systems, and we struggle with integration of master data. But what if we could have an ontology? And what if that ontology is set on a non-relational database? And what if that non-relational database was underneath a canonical infrastructure for visibility? Systems could learn, they could think, and we no longer have the issues with integration and master data. Now, the other technology I'm excited about is the Internet of Things, because I think Internet of Things is streaming data, which the open source in Hadoop is Spark, to be able to move data at a real-time basis. And this is a case study of Costa Coffee. And Costa Coffee is a coffee shop in London, and they said, what if we took the signal from the barista and we ran replenishment based upon that signal and transform replenishment, which many supply chains can do. I laugh because in the States we have a lot of Coca-Cola machines that allow us to alter the Coca-Cola going in the cup. But that machine was not enabled with Internet of Things for Coca-Cola to know the real-time sensing of the syrups. But Costa Coffee said, let me transform to drive replenishment outside in with sensing and totally transform the supply chain. And what if we could use 3D printing in novel ways? So every year I do a conference and I encourage people to come and talk about the future supply chain and present case studies. And this was a professor for Arizona State who talked about 3D printing, and he pulled a baby heart out of his pocket. Imagine facilitating a panel and a guy pulls a baby heart out of his pocket. He says, I printed this baby heart this morning. Imagine that we no longer have to be on lists for organ transplants, or imagine that we'll print cells for oncology drug testing. Imagine that we can transform the whole healthcare supply chain through 3D printing, whether it's medical device or the printing of organs. I said, let's talk. But then there was a presentation by a person from Logitech, and he talked about the ultimate ear, which is a specialized ear bud that people that sing or perform wear. And this earbud was on the long tail of the supply chain, and he could never keep it in stock. So he decided he was going to print the earbud and have a one-day turnaround on a postponed item that was personalized. And he began a campaign to totally redefine this business model. For 2 years, everyone laughed at him. Print an earbud? No way. But today, he prints earbuds. And he delivers the earbuds in a day where it used to be 4 weeks. And there's much higher satisfaction. So could we change the electrons and the atoms of the supply chain in 2030? I think so. But another capability that I think we really need to think about is the ability of the organization to listen. Today, there are horizontal processes, and one of the horizontal processes that people talk about is sales and operations planning. But what if you had a listening cross-functional process that stood at the intersection of the social and the interest graph, that allowed you to understand what your consumers thought of your products? So what is the social graph and what is an interest graph? My name is Lora Cecere, and I have 95,000 people that follow me on LinkedIn. That's my social graph. But I'm a grandmother, and I buy all things baby. And I fly a lot, so I'm interested in all the things that can help me fly. And I'm a gardener, and I'm a quilter, and those are my interest graph. And that's how people can sell to me. So when we listen, graph technologies allow us to understand who that consumer is. at the intersection of the social and interest graph. And if we mine the unstructured data and we have cross-functional listening, there are only 7 companies in the world that I think do this today, but it's an important concept, where we would meet cross-functionally and we'd look at customer data and we'd look at the relevance of that data against the social and interest graph. This is a case study of Newell Rubbermaid. Newell Rubbermaid introduced these green containers to the market, and they were so excited. They were designed to keep vegetables fresh. And they stuffed the market, and they all bought their t-shirts and did the high five because they were exceeding sales. Then they started to look at the rating and reviews. And rating and review data has almost no latency. Customer orders today have a lot of latency. And they could see that they were starting to drop on the rating and reviews. Very few people are using rating and review data today, but it's very important data. Great as causal factors, great indicators for what customers think if you're selling in the consumer value chain. And then they had a listening group that met once a week to look at social sentiment or unstructured data at the interest and social graph. And they started to see these consumer concerns. I was so disappointed in the product saver. I put my freshly washed lettuce in the product saver and it turned brown. Ah, they said. They weren't supposed to wash the lettuce, and they began a campaign to save this product to teach the consumer how to use the product. The consumer was not to wash the lettuce. Now, if they weren't listening, they would have probably done a second production run, and they would have written off product because they would not have known that the product was not meeting customer expectations. If we aren't listening, and if we're using conventional call centers, it'll take us 6 weeks to process the call center data back to action for quality. So listening and cross-functional listening, I think, is our next horizontal process. And another example is Lenovo. Lenovo implemented systems to mine social sentiment at the interest and social graph for their products globally and worldwide. And they listen weekly to look for patterns. So they can see patterns in different parts of the geographies. And they can see if they've got keyboard issues or what people are thinking about memory. And they can see this with latency of a week, whereas orders for Lenovo coming through the channel will have weeks and months worth of latency associated with it. And they meet weekly to talk about what those patterns are. And what does that mean for quality, or what does that mean for demand? A different form of social listening. So the ability to use unstructured text to listen, I think, is a capability for 2030. Now, not all companies adapt these at the same time. But think about the terminology I've used: social sentiment, rules-based ontologies, Hadoop, cognitive learning. To fill that skill gap, this is where you need to invest your time to really understand the next generation of analytics and visibility, because that's where the future of supply chain is going. And the conundrum is that many people are late adopters. So when we look at the continuum of early adopters versus late adopters, you can see 14% of companies are early adopters. So your company may not be an early adopter, but still, reskilling your brain and learning about these concepts helps you to talk the new language, to be ready to adapt. And not everybody moves at the same pace. So there's a path for laggards, a path for the late majority, a path for the early majority, and a path for the early adopters. Maybe you're not an early adopter, but you can have a path, and you can watch the industry adapt, and you can learn the language. Not everybody moves at the same time. So let me wrap up. I think we're 5 years away from supply chains that learn as we sleep. I think much of the planning systems that we've implemented, we will find are legacy. I think we need to invest in learning new forms of analytics, trialing new forms of analytics, and mining structured and unstructured data. And as we do this, I think we've got to learn from the past to say, maybe we don't have best practices if 9 out of 10 companies are stuck. To unlearn, to rethink the processes outside in, to use social data, to use channel data, and rewire our brains. And value network automation is happening pretty fast and furiously. We need to get past EDI and ERP integration to really embrace supply chain operating networks and to be able to drive the network of networks. So that's my belief in 2030. What are your questions? Well, I will be in the International Lounge if anybody wants to come and ask me a question about any of the crazy terms that I've just talked about. And have a great conference. And follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I answer every question. Thank you very much.